Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The first use of our brand new podium in Bentleys. Rather a fine job done by the AV company. So, look, we all know who he is. Okay, I'm going to hand you over to Mark Nelson, who's going to keep you entertained for an hour. And then I'm going to keep you away from the bar for 45 minutes. So, Mark, all over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Cheers. And this is why I love GSE. There's the photo op. Thank you, Mark. That was stunningly wonderful. I'm Mark Nelson, member of the RACF development team from beautiful Poughkeepsie, New York. We're going to have a session here talking a little bit about risk assessment. We called it We're Only Human, but what it really is why do humans suck at risk assessment? And more importantly, why do I suck at it? So we're going to look at some of the influences we might have in our lives as we're attempting to make the best decisions possible. So a little bit about me. I've been in IBM for 41 years, been a member of the RACF development team for 37. I literally started a 6-month temporary assignment, discovered that I love the people, I love the product, I love the mission, and I just decided to stick around for a little bit longer. Prior to IBM, I was a systems programmer at Grumman Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island. Before that, I was an operator at a company called Time Sharing Resources. And somewhere about 35 years ago, I discovered I like to fly airplanes. And the discipline you have when learning how to fly and actually executing a flight in the most safe and possible manner is something that I think is transferable to the things we do in IT, we do regularly as part of our jobs. I love coming to this conference. Thank you again, Mr. Wilson, for inviting me. Mr. Wilson and my path have been crossing for a rather long time. First time, Mark, do you remember that? 2000, we both made it to the cover. That's right, we were the eye candy at this conference. I'm just going to point out, your photo looks like a mugshot.
It probably was.
But good times, that old Zephon conference many, many years ago. So thank you again for inviting me here. It's fabulous. I'm from IBM Poughkeepsie. Poughkeepsie is New York, upstate, and a little bit to the left. That is the campus. I'm parked in there somewhere by the blue arrow. I love the fact that in IBM Poughkeepsie, we have been the home of the mainframe for well over 60 years. Well over 60 years. We say mainframe is in our DNA, right? So in a way, that's kind of the old and the current. Have you guys heard about this thing called quantum? We got quantum machines in Poughkeepsie. And the thing that blows my mind about quantum machines is in order to make that technology work, they have to be really cold. Parts of them have to be really, really cold, like 15 microkelvins above absolute zero. It's colder than outer space, and it's about 500 feet from where my office is. So. Heads explode. We actually had the President of the United States come and visit us last year to celebrate something called the CHIPS Act. President Joe Biden. Whatever your politics are, it's a big thing when the president comes to town. And he happened to come to town on the day that I was celebrating my 40th anniversary with IBM. IBM allowed me to have a picnic out on the Hudson River, invited about 50 folks over, and a couple of days before, they said, you know, the president's coming to town. We may have to make a few changes, right? Well, I figured out pretty quickly that those changes included canceling the event and having to reschedule, which is kind of a pain. And I will tell you, I whined to absolutely everybody. But it pays to whine just a little bit because I got invited to sit and be in the presence of the president as he is making his speech to IBM. This was a hot ticket. About 400 folks in there. My manager didn't go. My manager's manager didn't go. My manager's manager didn't go. But I got to go. And during the event, I'm kind of slacking, tweeting, sending messages out to my peers. And somebody sends me the screen image saying, "My God, Mark, we can see you on the White House video, the official video feed. That's you." And I looked and said, how did you know that was me? And their answer was, well, it's that Charlie Brown head of yours. Well, whatever it is, they saw me there, and President Biden got to see the quantum machine that we have. It looks like a chandelier when it's uncovered. Pretty much amazing technology. Now, Normally, if this were a traditional keynote session, somebody from IBM would get up here and start talking about all the latest things we've done. We've talked about the Z16 with the Telum processors, the quantum safe stuff, z/OS 3.1, the enabled for AI stuff. We would spend all that time selling you on this. This is not that session, but I really want you to pretend like it is. So fire up your phone, go to buycrapfromibm.com or whatever the URL is, buy a Z16, buy 2 Z16s, order z/OS 3.1, put yourself on that path. You want to be there. There are lots of sessions the rest of this week to talk why. Now, this session is about something a lot more interesting, in some way a lot more important. It's all about just being human. And it's all about that pound of, or those several pounds of stuff on top of our necks, most of us have, right? Our minds and how we make our decisions, and perhaps there are things we can look at and make better decisions about. So decisions, they're all about calculating risks. And those calculations that we do implicitly several times, probably every hour, they're going to be completely influenced by the entirety of our life's experiences. And quite frankly, at times, we are not really good at making the best possible decisions, and that's what we're going to be exploring. So I mentioned earlier that I'm a private pilot, so not a commercial pilot. I fly strictly for the joy of flight. But I love studying aviation. I love the process of aviation. I love how all the pieces integrate together. And I love the way that we think about risk when we're thinking about aviation or flying activities. And I have a very personal reason for being as interested in it as I am. And that's my Cessna. I really don't want to wreck that aircraft. But more importantly, I've got a family that I want to return home to. So those are my daughters. This photo, to be true, is about 20 years old. How many folks have kids? How many folks have? Are your kids around this age? And if they are, do you still think of them as if, mine are in their 20s. Do you still think of them sort of as they're in the younger years? So that's my view of my kids. But I will say for the record, my wife, Julie, has not aged one moment since this photo was taken. And many of you got to meet her. She was working the check-in desk for names that began with C and D. Okay, so she may have checked you in it, and just agree with me, and that'll make my life a lot easier. So when we talk about risk, there is this fundamental risk equation that folks talk about. It's a very simple equation. It's a linear equation. Oh, I threw a math term out, sorry. It's an equation in 2 variables, right, not to any kind of power. And the 2 variables that are in here are the impact. What happens if something bad happens? How do we quantify what that bad thing is? And you can express it in pretty much any unit of measure that is appropriate. Dollars, pounds, lira, person months, furlongs per fortnight, it really doesn't matter. The second part of the equation is the likelihood, the probability. What are the odds of this bad thing happening? Right? And it's a beautiful equation. 2 numbers, you multiply them together, and you get a result. And that represents what your risk is. It is a very precise equation, but we have to distinguish between precision and accuracy, right? Accuracy is going to be influenced by how good those numbers are. Ooh, and speaking of things that I should have spoken about earlier, if you have questions, comments, anything like that, don't even bother raising your hand. Just shout out. And for folks who've been to my sessions before, you wonder, is he going to reward me with a chunk of candy? The answer is, I got 3 pounds up here. I will warn you, my aim sucks. Just saying. But my wife, Julie, has agreed to run it to you should you ask a question and deserve a chocolate, which you will. So, precision, precise, yes. Accurate, it really depends. And that's what we're going to be talking about. Once you've acknowledged that you have risk, you really have only 4 things you can do about it. 2 of them come right out of the equation. Reduce either of those 2 numbers. Reduce the probability or reduce the impact, and you've reduced the risk. That kind of makes sense. The next one, we call it insuring the risk. It's really sharing the risk. It's saying that if this bad thing happens, you will come and help me. You will pay me money to help address this. Right? So that's sharing the risk or insuring the risk. The last one that we have is just accepting the risk. That's actually the polite way. The other way of looking at it is, I'm just going to choose to ignore it. And sadly, there's so much risk that folks just choose to ignore. But that, in a way, is a choice. But all of this, except for ignore, assumes that you've done a credible job in assessing what the risk is. and that's where the problems occur. Now, as humans, we're not particularly great at doing this risk calculation, especially when it's sort of just implied as we're going about our daily lives. We will underestimate the risks that we willingly take. My two examples of that, my personal bad diet, right, and people who smoke. Lots of other examples, but we underestimate these things that we voluntarily take. Second thing, if there is something that has a desired benefit, we will ignore the risk because we really, really want whatever that desired benefit is. Another one is if we've been engaged in a risky activity for some period of time, we become desensitized to it. We will simply say, well, I didn't get killed the first time, so I'll do it again, do it again. No, that's not motorcycle riding. I wasn't referring to that, Mr. Wilson. But we should have a conversation about that. We will overestimate risks which are not in our control. If we can control something, if we think we can control something, we're a lot more willing to accept it. We will exaggerate spectacular but rare risks and downplay common risks. The example there, flying in an aircraft, commercial aircraft, versus driving the same distance. Which is safer? It turns out driving is. Yeah, there's an old saying that you're more at risk driving to the airport than the flight that you're about to take, and that's absolutely true. Right? So bottom line is we really don't do a great job when we're trying to assess risk just on this sort of informal way that we do all the time. So the question we have to ask ourselves is why? So what gets in the way? And the answer is our humanness. How many folks here are human? Just checking, and the hands that didn't go up, your management, right? Yeah, good, that's why. Or auditors, sorry. Right, so what gets in the way of actually understanding and managing this correctly? Well, lots of different things. The first part of that equation is probability. Probability is not an easy thing to understand, and we'll take you through two examples in a few moments. And then we have this set of things folks just call sort of human biases, right? Humans tend to be optimistic in some situations, pessimistic in others. We tend to, when we look at a set of data, we will cherry pick out the data that confirms what we want to be confirmed and ignore things which we think don't confirm what we are expecting. We have this illusion that we are better than we are. We'll all live in our personal Lake Wobegon, for those of you from the States, where every child is above average. Right? When people are asked to assess their own abilities at something like driving, the number of folks who say they are above average is well above 50%. It's like 70 or 80%. So we have this overconfidence. We will often stick with our first impression, our first decision, our first thought, even when the data comes in and says that's really not the right decision. But we anchor ourselves, that's the buzzword, we anchor ourselves to those things. We will often see patterns where there really are no patterns. We will look at random things and try to make some sense out of them when they're really just random events. We will take situations and evaluate them in the wrong context. So we'll try to draw parallels where one shouldn't be drawing parallels. We have a tendency to believe the experts because, well, they're the experts and they know better. Maybe they don't. We will often focus on our own self-interest, a bias that says, I really want what's best for me, right, even when it's really not best for me. And we'll often have this fear of challenging or changing the status quo. That's kind of an anchoring kind of thing, but it's worthy of mention. So all of this is just related to being human. So let's talk about the first one, probability. So if I were to take a fair coin and flip it right here, right now, what are the odds of it coming up heads? 50-50. I heard 51. Why 51?
It's just, there is this error. Actually, there is also a chance of it landing on the side.
It will never land on its side. but I'm not a good, Julie, give him a chocolate. That's awesome. But
if it's European or American. Europeans, they have an 80% chance of landing on the head, I think. And Americans, it's something else.
My head is exploding. I would argue that it's time for a Guinness. I would argue. Oh wait, it makes more sense now. I would argue that it's a what they call a true coin or a fair coin, right? So it's going to be 50-50, 1 in 2 kind of thing. If I flip it again, what's the probability of getting the second head, right? It's 1 in 4, right? 25%. If I flip it 100 times and I get 100 heads, what are the chances of that?
Next to nothing.
Pretty damn small. It's a technical term, right? Next to nothing, right? But how did I frame that? What if I said I flipped it 1,000,000 times? What are the chances of having 100 of the same way, of 100 heads? And the answer is it's actually not that rare. And if it's 2 million, it's even more likely to happen. So the point is, you have to look at the probability in context of the entirety of the situation, not just from the more simplistic one. This example I got out of a book called Freakonomics. It's a fabulous book. It's a couple of economists who look at social things from the math perspective of economists. And they have this wonderful example in there that talks to medical tests and exactly the math behind medical tests. So here's the situation, right? Your doctor says you are of the age where you need to take this screening exam, right? You're screening for a disease which will hit 0.5% of the population. And the test you're taking is 98% accurate. I don't know about you, but if my doctor says it's 98% accurate, I'm thinking, that's pretty darn good. So you go out, and let's talk about what 98% accurate means. It means if you actually have the disease, and the test 98% of the time will tell you accurately you have the disease. But 2% of the time, it's going to report a negative. It's going to give you a false negative. Similarly, if you don't have the disease, 98% of the time it'll tell you you don't have a disease, but 2% of the time it will tell you that you have the disease, right? A false positive. Now, when you go out and buy some of these over-the-counter tests, they will actually give you the numbers. And this thing that we just lived through, COVID, I remember when I got one of the exam packets, I opened it up, and it would be accurate on the positive side, something like 90%. That's not bad. Right, but on the negative side, it was about 60 or 70%. So it was a little bit better. So if you tested positive, you probably should isolate. But if you tested negative, you should probably test again, right? Which is why they told you, because if you just blindly said, I ain't got anything, you started running around, you were not doing the appropriate thing. So in this example, it's 98% accurate. You take this test, and it comes back positive. What are the chances you actually have whatever that disease is? You think it's around above, a show of hands, above 90%? Oh, you're so smart. Above 80%? 70? We'll go down by 10. 60? Nobody wants to put the hand up. 50? 40? All right. It turns out that it's about 1 in 5. That hit me. I almost did a palm plant on my forehead. What? Well, let's take you through an example. Let's say you got 10,000 people, right, of the general pool, and they all take the exam. Now, in that 10,000, if we know that the percentage who have the disease is 0.5%, is 0.5%, we know that 50 will actually have it. So out of that 50 people who actually have it, right, remember that it's 98% accurate, 49 of them will be told correctly that they have disease, and 1 will be lied to. 1 will get the false negative, right? And they will be told they do not have it. Now let's focus on that other group. If 50 had it out of 10,000, that's 9,950 who did not have it. Right now, 98% of them, right, will find out that they do not have it accurately, but 2% of that 9,950 will get that false positive. So when you look at the false positive number, you have about 199. The ratio of 199 to the total is about 19%. It's actually 49, not 99. Right? But it's about 19.76%. Right? So I didn't go all the way down because nobody was putting their hands up, but if you put your hand up at about 20%, you would have been right. Probability is not trivial to understand. Right? And my data point for that, how many of you have been to a casino? There we go. Right? What's the one thing that's guaranteed at a casino? The house wins. I didn't want to say you lose. That's kind of negative. The house wins. It's true. They are betting. They're literally betting that you won't figure that out. But you're all smarter than that. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of biases, 5 in particular, but there are a lot more. You cannot read that. I know you're not supposed to put up a chart you can't read, but the URL is there, 181 different biases. Click on the link, find out more about them. We're going to talk about 5 of them associated with that thing that I love to do on the side, flying, aviation. So this is fighting cognitive biases in aviation. Now, the reason why I talk about aviation is I think aviation and IT have some serious, serious parallels. And we can learn from what happens in IT, in aviation, and apply it to IT. So why are they similar? What makes them similar? Well, both aviation and IT have several different types of activities going on in them. In aviation, it's commercial aviation, general aviation, the kind of stuff that I do, air taxi. They really are airplanes flying with people, right? But there are different aspects to them and how they relate to each other. Similarly, in IT, right? We've got transactional systems, we have AI, we've got the gamut of different types of environments, all of which have to interoperate correctly for us to have the systems that we want. Both of these are very complex systems of hardware, software, and of course, end user folks. The end users have this similar expectations of reliability. How many folks are happy when their flight is delayed? Yeah. How many folks were ticked off when you found out the Wi-Fi wasn't perfect in every corner of the hotel, right? We've become so spoiled, right? But big difference between IT and aviation. In aviation, when mistakes happen, people die. Yeah, and it does happen in IT. We've had some cases of compromised keys that were being used for allegedly secure types of communication, and they really weren't. There were issues years ago about software that was miscalculating dosage on radiation devices. Yeah, but those are kind of more isolated kinds of things. Where in aviation, something goes bad, people die. Now, there is one other thing that we have in common: stupid users. But you all know about the stupid users in IT, but this is my collection of morons who fly when their aircraft lands on fire, and what do? They pick up their luggage as they're deplaning the aircraft. Anytime I fly, I ask for the exit row. When they ask you that question, are you willing to help in the event of an emergency, I respond in the affirmative. And I look the flight attendant in the eye and I say, and I will punch out anyone who attempts to leave with anything in their arms other than their children. And they look at me and said, thank you. But in each case there, you've got folks who've taken, there's one person, they're taking a friggin' selfie of the aircraft on fire. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know much about what to do in an aviation crash, but here's my suggestion. Keep the flames behind you and walk as fast as you can in the forward direction. Stop only when you hit a fence. Amazing what people will do. Now, aviation has been incredibly successful at driving risk out of their environment. The top part of that graph goes back to the 50s. Yeah, I went back a long time. And the lines there are indicating it's not linear. It's logarithmic at that point. So we saw this substantial decline. And I ended this year at 2014. The numbers have pretty much stayed flat. Aviation, in terms of accidents per million miles, has gotten phenomenally safe. William H. Murray, a name that is familiar to some folks who do security, once talked about aviation safety and what the improvements they had made, and he pointed out that if we had the same accident rate that existed in the late 30s, it would be equivalent today in terms of miles flown of 2 fully loaded 747 Boeing aircraft crashing every week. Right? Would you fly if aircraft were that unsafe? And the answer is no. So for substantially wonderful business reasons, the aviation has been focusing on this for many, many years. So can we learn from this, from the aviation? I say it's yes. So in terms of biases, I turned to a guy named Gene Benson. He's a flight instructor. He's instructed tens of thousands of hours, but he's also a human factors specialist. And he's done a lot of analysis of general aviation incidents and accidents and tried to look at what has happened and see if there were mental cognitive biases involved that could be addressed. He came up with 3. And in his list, optimism. Bad things happen to other people. I'm lucky. This will not happen to whatever this might be. I'm an optimist. I think the risk is, I minimize the risk internally as I calculate it. The second one, confirmation bias. If I am presented with a pool of data, I will cherry pick. I will ignore the things that don't confirm what I want to believe, and I will accept the things that reinforce what I believe. And the third he points out is overconfidence or illusory superiority. We just think that we are better than we are. Now, I've had some conversations with Flight Instructor Benson, and I've suggested I have 2 things I'd like to add to his list. Anchoring. We start with our first impressions. For a pilot, that first impression is, that's my destination. I want to go there. There's another phrase for this in the emergency services world. That's called the mission focus. The guys that fly the helicopters to rescue people, they are so focused on doing that, they will sometimes ignore risks. They will put themselves in peril because they have a mission focus. My job is to rescue that person. And there have been incidents where they possibly ignored things that, in hindsight, they shouldn't have ignored. So anchoring is one. And authority. If someone who is in a position of authority says X, you will believe it because, again, they're in a position of authority. Now, I have a case study, and I know this case study better than anybody in the world because the case study is me. Right? The case study is actually a pretty straightforward and pretty routine aviation event. I was flying from my home in Poughkeepsie, New York, and I was flying down to Farmingdale, Long Island. It's not a very long flight. It's about, as the crow flies, about 58 nautical miles. But I'm a safe pilot. I don't just want to fly straight like that. I'm going to use navigational aids. Yes, this is so old, we didn't have GPSs in the aircraft yet. So I'm flying from Poughkeepsie over to an airport. I'm just going to overfly it about 7 miles away called Stormville. I can see it. Then I'm going to fly from that to a VOR, very high frequency, omnidirectional radio. I can't believe I remembered that, right? Because we don't use these things anymore, much. Right? Then I'm going to fly to that. That's a navigational aid. Then I'll fly from there to another navigational aid that is maybe 35 or 40 miles away. Then I make a right turn and I go to my destination, which is Farmingdale. Farmingdale is a very, very busy airport. I think it's one of the busiest outside of JFK, LaGuardia, Newark, and things like that. Very busy general aviation aircraft. So flying that additional stuff, that only adds 6 nautical miles, 7 nautical miles to the trip. Yeah, that sounds good. Now, before a flight, we are religious about getting a weather briefing. We get these online now. Back then, I think I got this one online. This was in the late 90s. And when they give you the weather forecast, they give you the forecast for where you are. Well, I can look out and see that. And they give it for the destination. And the destination, their forecast wasn't bad, and their current conditions weren't bad either. Little background on what I mean by not bad at all. The legal minimum for me to fly for flight visibility, for visual flight rules flying, which is what I do, is 3 miles. Less than 3 mile visibility, I'm not allowed to fly there. More than 3 miles of visibility, I am legally allowed. Doesn't mean it's smart, but it does mean it is legal. So I look at the weather forecast, and the forecast is better than 6 mile visibility. That's really all they said for the route of flight. Oh, you know what? 30 is better than 6. 70 is better than 6. But they don't say that. They just say better than 6. I'm an optimist. I looked at that and said, boom, it's got to be good. By the way, I should also point out, I'm a developer, and all developers are optimists. And I work with a test team. All testers are pessimists. Yeah, thank God for that. Just thank God for that. So I'm an optimist. I'm thinking, this is probably going to be good. This will be fine. Now, I've flown out of Poughkeepsie at this point for 15 years, so I'm familiar with the approaches, how to get out of it. I know the topography very well. And I went to college literally next door to this airport. Right? Now, what does that mean in terms of knowledge of the airport? Bupkis, right? But it did give me a feeling like, well, I know something about this, so it must be okay. Right? And the last bit of info I'll put into this is I was working with air traffic control. It's called flight following. It is voluntary. I don't have to do it. But if they're able to assist me, they will. You just call them up on the frequency and say, hi, I'd like flight following. Here's my destination. And if their workload permits it, they will give me advisory information, basically telling them about the other aircraft they know about so we don't have a merging of tin because that's bad. That's bad. All right, so what happens? Well, I had optimistically said it was going to be about better than 6 miles. When I left, it was 10. 10 is better than 6, but it's going to get better, isn't it? Yeah, it didn't, right? As I always find out, it would get worse. Now, at that point in time, I had about 300 hours of flight experience. And I don't know if that sounds like a lot or a little, but trust me, it ain't very much. And there's an interesting stat, which I've heard, but I've yet to find a formal study, but the interesting colloquial knowledge is that you're most at risk between 200 hours and 400 hours of flight time, because you've gotten beyond the initial sort of the basics, and your confidence is higher than your skills. And I'm right in the middle of that. And I'm going to say that my data point is that is true, that we think more than we can. I had checked for reports of visibility along my flight, and I was hearing some contradictory information. The places that were equal to where I was and north were 10, 15, 20 miles visibility. But when you look south, when I look south to, let's say, along the River Groton, I think it was reporting 6 or 7, and my destination was reporting 3. Remember I said that's the legal minimum? Right, so if it gets any worse there, I ain't getting in. Right, this is something called special VFR, but I wasn't going to do that. Oh, and I was talking to air traffic control, and they never mentioned anything about there being a problem with visibility. They're not supposed to. That's my job. But again, I look at them as an authority. If there's something bad, of course they would. No, they're not going to tell me. Oh, and you know, I grew up in this area. I was just overly familiar. Now, I will tell you, at one point, when I'm over Long Island Sound, that's this area right here, I am I think I'm about 4 miles from each shore. Right? The visibility was so low, I couldn't see a shore. Couldn't see it behind me, couldn't see it in front of me. I could see the water 4,000 feet below me, though. And somehow that made me feel better. Now, the good news is this only lasted for 30 seconds to 60 seconds. Then I could see the shore, and it continued onward. So, bottom line, at the end of this flight, what happened? And the answer, nothing really bad. The only sort of mishap that I had to actually confess to is as I was lining up, they cleared me to land on runway 19, which heads directly south. I'm flying in, so 19 is going to be off this way, but because of the haze and the lack of visibility, I didn't see it, but I saw this other one which was cutting through my visibility at a more oblique angle, runway 14. So I actually started to set up to land on the wrong runway. And the alert air traffic control specialist at Farmingdale, 4538 Echo, the runway is to your left, moron. They didn't say that, but I could sense their displeasure. So nothing bad happened, and I'll tell you, before I started thinking about risk and biases, I would have sat there and said, yeah, nothing bad happened. But now that I think about it, I have to ask myself the question, would I do this again today, knowing what I know? And I'm not going to tell you the answer to that till we get closer to the end because, well, I got to do something to keep you in the room. So let's talk a little bit about the tools that we have to help us through all this kind of thing. The first one is just education, learning. And you're doing that here by coming to a session like this. A random session just talked about risks and being human, and you showed up. Thank you very much for doing that. There are other sessions here that talk about being human and the effect of human influences on things. Either here, other places, there's lots of places you can look online and do so. It's a fascinating, fascinating subject. Let me just, a quick thought experiment. I just confessed a little bit to something that had happened to me. Have you had something in your lives where in hindsight, I'm seeing a lot of smiles, did you go driving in a situation where perhaps one should not have? Right? Any of those kinds of things. Educational decisions. And I suspect many of us are thinking back to our misspent youth. I know I am when I started asking this question, but there's a whole bunch of things that I would do a lot differently now than I did when I was 18, 20, 22, because let's face it, if you're male and you're under 25, you are an idiot. And I apologize to the students that are here. I shouldn't have said it that way. You are fine members of the academic community, but you do have things to learn. So, yes?
I've been chuckling a lot because I can absolutely say yes to that question, but in my case, it wasn't 3 nautical miles visibility, it was cloud base of about 800 feet.
800, all right, so you're a pilot. That,
I used to be, but
no, you still are.
I've got a family, but I have flown, yeah.
All right, so you are a certificated pilot. You flew when it was 800 foot, and are you IFR rated?
I was not at the time.
Okay, and was the aircraft IFR equipped?
It was.
It was, all right. So you had a certificate, that's good. You'd had some IFR training, at least in the US, that's required. You weren't current or certified for that. So
I had, it gets complicated. I had what we call an IMC certificate, which is a UK
okay.
light instrument rating, if you will.
Okay, so you were certificated for that kind of flight. Did you expect it to be 800 foot?
No.
I love the way you answered that. Yeah, it does happen. I was on a night flight. I don't think you were with. I can't remember if you were with me, Julie. I was with a flight instructor. I was with a flight instructor. So it was nighttime, and just as we're flying, it's perfectly clear out, and suddenly we're in the middle of a cloud. And the way you recognize it is the flash, the strobes are suddenly all around you, right? The white is just reflecting off everything. So the instructor just looks at me and says, what are you going to do? And my first response, I'm going to pray. He said, oh, good, that's plan A, right? What's plan B? I'm going to execute a standard rate turn and hope that whatever I have is not enveloping me and I'll be able to escape. And we did, right? So yeah, it does happen. It does, and we do train for those kinds of things as you're getting your flight instruction. But sometimes, when they hit when you don't expect, you got to make sure that you react appropriately. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. And let's talk aviation after this. All right. So there are a couple of things that we do in aviation that I think are perfectly applicable to lots of other environments. And the first one is the checklist. Are you guys in the UK, are you guys religious on checklists as part of your training?
When training, absolutely. Yes.
Ooh. When training.
We tend to call it a do list.
Okay. So I thank you again for being brutally honest. It's the same in the States, right? The checklist, you will be drilled on it as part of your certification, as they're giving you your road test to get your certificate, to actually be allowed to fly. I will say the compliance on checklist in my own little flying club is not 100%. Right? But I firmly believe it's an important thing to do because A, I'm not all that experienced, and there have been instances of folks who have this, we call it the kick the tires and light the fires, right? Oh, I can look out, the weather looks fine. They literally go over, check to make sure there's oil, and that's it, right? And to me, that is not doing the things you need to do so you can come back to your family. If nothing else, it's going to look really stupid on the NTSB report as they're analyzing your fragmented body in the aircraft. And then they notice that they look at any of the footage that's recorded at the airport, and they say, oh, he didn't use a checklist, and he had no fuel. It's not going to look good. But the checklist came out because of a situation just like that. It was in the 40s. It was a military flight with an incredibly, incredibly skilled crew. Thousands of hours of experience, and they left some locks in the aircraft, some control surface locks. So when they rotated off the ground, they couldn't control the aircraft. They crashed, people perished. And they realized that you almost need the checklist the more skilled you are. Right? So I am a firm believer in checklists. It's a logical presentation of the things you need to do in the order you need to do them. One of them up there, I love it. It says, start the engine. I can tell you with metaphysical certitude, I have never flown my aircraft without starting the engine. But it does have other things around it, like how to adjust the mixture, how to make sure the prop has been cleared, how to make sure that the ammeter is charging, right? There's all kinds of things you do around that. So the starting the engine isn't the important stuff, it's all the other stuff around it. Roughly 30% of general aviation accidents in the US are fuel exhaustion. Somebody ran out of fuel. And I look at that and say the relationship between aircraft flight time and fuel consumption is pretty well known, right? So if the aircraft that I sold it in crashed because one of the pilots was flying it and ran out of fuel. Yeah, he flew somewhere and the fuel farm was closed, and then he flew by 15 different airports on the way back to our airport, because he thought he could make it, and he was just shy by about this much. it doesn't matter. This much could have killed him, right? He walked away from it. He found the golf course, totaled the aircraft. He walked away in a way that's the happiest ending you could have. But why did you fly without doing that basic, making sure you have a fuel on board? And in fact, on the checklist, it doesn't say verify fuel. It says go to the fuel tank, open it up, visually verify how much fuel you have, make sure the cap is locked. Again, things you want to do to prevent the probability of something really bad happening. So what does this help address? That overconfidence of kick the tires and light the fires, right? Or the optimism of, yeah, I think I got enough fuel. Really? Think you have enough fuel? Not good enough. And then anchoring, the concept of, I decided I'm going to go fly, and I'm just going to go fly, right? So the checklist, wonderful thing to help address those basic biases. And this is one of my favorites that kind of came out of the situation I had that I just described. We call these the personal minima, or the never will I ever. So I sat down with a flight instructor who knew my capabilities and said, we need to come up with some rules I can look at. So at the time that I'm making a decision, I have already done the calculation and set the rules. I know what the law says. The law says, 3 miles of visibility. Right? But I now have 600 hours. I don't have a boatload of time. I do not have that instrument rating or anything like that. I have done a fair amount of instrument instruction, but that doesn't count, right? So if I'm doing a daytime local thing where I'm just flying around the airport, we call this the $100 hamburger. Get in the aircraft, fly somewhere, have lunch, fly back. I want 6 miles of visibility and a ceiling of at least 3,000. I got to tell you, I'm questioning that 3,000 now, because 2 weeks ago, Julie and I went flying. The ceiling was supposed to be 6. When we got back to the airport, it was 4,900. And you have to say 1,000 feet below, and it was a little lower than I want. So the personal minimums, I will probably change this and make it a little more stringent based upon some of my experiences. If I'm going more than, let's say, 10 or 25 miles, I want 10 miles of visibility and a little more ceiling. If I'm doing something at night, I want a heck of a lot more visibility and a much higher ceiling. I don't fly at night much, right? But if I do, I want to make sure that if the weather is a little worse than it was predicted, I'll still be able to find the airport I need to get to. So personal minima, you set lists of things that you simply will not violate. And I do review this when I go up with an instructor every 2 years. The fourth one, I call this predetermined evaluations, or figuring out what you're going to take, what actions you will take based upon the probability and the impact. This is straight out of how the FAA in the US does its risk calculation. They look at the probability, right, as 5 possible categories. Extremely improbable, extremely remote. Those both sound like rare to me, but they do separate them. Remote, probable, and frequent. And then they look at the impact, right? Minimal, minor, major, hazardous, catastrophic. Catastrophic, multiple fatalities, loss of hull. Hazardous is loss of hull. I think it might be small number of fatalities. And the one I love there is like minimal impact. That's passenger discomfort. Every flight is minimal impact. Everyone, right? But the idea being, even if you have something that is extremely improbable, right, but is catastrophic, you have to take an action. What's the IT example of something that is or could be catastrophic in nature? Right? What's that again?
Plane landing on the data center.
Say again?
Plane landing on the data center.
Plane landing on not what I had in mind, but damn good example, yes. In fact, I was chatting with somebody years ago who said our data center was on the approach end of some runway at Seattle, right? And then they realized, ooh, maybe there's a better place for this, and they moved.
747 event, right?
Was that? Well, it wouldn't be a 7 because that's Boeing is based out there, yes. So certainly that's a risk somebody should have thought about earlier on. Now I'm thinking of something that's actually far, far, far more common. How many of you have APF authorized data sets? Every hand goes up. Almost every hand goes up. Those paying attention's hand went up. Yeah. If you have an unprotected APF data set, you have something of that can potentially be catastrophic. What do I consider catastrophic? I consider catastrophic your system can be destroyed without any hope of restoration. Did anybody get scared when I said without any hope of restoration? You should be, If the attacker is truly motivated and knows the time frame and the mechanism of your backup procedures, they can time their attack in the worst possible way. You'll be lucky, right? And you'll be happy if all they do is destroy your data and you can restore everything. That's the good part. Yeah, you'll tighten up your APF access list and do the right things after that. But yeah, so these are the kinds of things. There's a guy in IBM named Carl Schmitz who did integrity for years, retired a couple of years ago, and we had a couple of conversations about this thinking, right? Of predetermining what clients should do, what installations should do when they see these things coming into play. And yeah, APF authorization, we agreed, catastrophic. Catastrophic. What are the things you can do to mediate some of the threats on that? Multi-factor authentication, constant monitoring. We'll talk about those in so many sessions later here, but predetermine what you're going to do so that while you're in the middle of the situation and some operations person says, well, it's only one data set, right? You can look at them and say, you're an idiot. I wouldn't say it that way. All right. The last thing, oh good, we'll have time for this. I call this holding to a core set of beliefs, but it's a wonderful example, and I'm actually giving you the punchline in a way, and forgive me for doing that, but here's the situation. Providence, Rhode Island, 1999, so it's a long time ago. The weather is really crappy. Visibility is about 100 foot. The runway visibility range is about 1,000 feet. So it's just horrible conditions, but perfectly legal to take off and land, as we'll see in a moment. There are 4 actors in this little mini play that we're going to talk about. United 1448. It's an aircraft that has just been cleared to land on runway 5R. Right? The air traffic control tower is going to be giving them some directions to taxi. There's a FedEx aircraft waiting for the departure and another aircraft behind them waiting for departure as well. So what happens is that the aircraft that has been cleared to land, which is the United 1448, he lands and they come up to this taxiway and they're told to get to the terminal, which is up there. They're to make a left turn onto this taxiway, Taxiway November. They're going to take Taxiway November right to the top of that chart, and they're going to intersect with Taxiway Bravo, and they're going to, Taxiway November, and then to Tango, and take that to the terminal, right? So it's supposed to go up this and over there. They actually, so foggy out, they make the wrong turn here, and they end up on Taxiway Bravo, and they follow this along. So they go along, and then they get to this point, and they realize they're not where they're supposed to be. They also realize they're sitting on a runway. And they're sitting on a runway while there are 2 other aircraft about to take off. This is called a disaster in the making. So the one guy, UAL 1448, they tell the tower, hey, guys, we're on the runway. And the tower, no, you can't be on the runway. I told you to go here. Right? You must be here. You can't be there. Now, there's no ground proximity radar. The tower can't see them. They're working on just the reports, and the report from the guy and the gal sitting in the front of that aircraft is, we're on a runway. And in fact, you'll hear it in a moment. While they're sitting there saying, we're on a runway, you can hear an aircraft taking off in front of them. And the guy, man, there's an aircraft, it just took off in front of us. And the tower still says, no, it can't be. You must be drinking. Oh, they didn't say that, right? In fact, they did say something that I didn't catch the first couple of times I listened to this. They told the United guy to shut up. Now, they don't say shut up, that's too impolite. They say stand by. Right, so now we have the decision. We just had a near miss, and we have another aircraft, right? US Air 2998 is cleared for takeoff. And, well, we'll see what happens. And since I already said nothing bad happened, I kind of killed the joke, so sorry about that. But let's listen to it. The text will appear there, and let's see if the sound starts.
United 1448, what's your position? And we're clear of the runway on November by Bravo, United 1448. United 1448, thank you. Taxi to the ramp, your taxi is November and Tango, report crossing runway 16. Okay, November, Tango will report crossing wind 16 on the 1448.
Ground answer 2998 is home short behind FedEx.
Answer 2998, thank you.
That's the guy there.
FedEx 1662, runway 5 right, fly runway heading, cleared for takeoff.
Runway heading, clear for takeoff, 5 right, FedEx 1662.
Now 1448 is on November by the runways here. We don't see the
we clear across straight ahead on November.
United 1448, affirmative, cross runway 16, join taxiway November Tango on the other side.
Tango on the other side, United 1448.
So they think they're going to go straight
And
across.
United 1448, we're approaching Kilo here. Somebody just took off.
United 1448, you shouldn't be anywhere near Kilo. Hold your position, please. Just stop.
Stop on the runway.
Hi, this is United 1448. We are currently on a runway. I was looking out to the right with a Kilo. We need to go on to the Kilo taxiway. United 1448, you were supposed to taxi November in Tango. I need to know what runway you're on. I can't see anything from the tower.
Ma'am, we are on 23 right, intersection of 16, and we did not connect on November. We are by Kilo to our right, and we just overshot Kilo. We did not see it. Runway on 23 left here.
United, stand by, please.
Shut
Yes,
up.
sir, 2998, runway 5 right, fly runway heading cleared for takeoff.
Ma'am, I'm trying to advise you we're on an active runway, United 1448.
2P right is not an active runway. It's a taxiway when we're IFR or in the dark. US sir, 2998, runway 5 right, fly runway heading cleared for takeoff.
Tower user 2998, so we figure out what's going on down there. We're just going to stay clear of all runways.
Yes, sir, 2998, roger. Hold short of runway 5 right. It's not anywhere near the runway, but you can hold short.
Okay.
Okay, that man is a hero. I just love that. There's nobody on the runway, but if you want to stay there and save a couple of hundred lives, you know, that's fine by me. But, you know, every time I listen to that, I get something different out of it. I mean, everybody in there was acting in some respects to the best of their abilities. The guy that made the mistake, the guy and the gal in the flight that ended up on the wrong taxiway, right? They realized their mistake. They confessed as soon as they had a mistake, and they're trying to get air traffic control to understand the magnitude of their error. The fact that you could actually hear the aircraft zooming in front of them, I thought would have been a bigger hint, but apparently it wasn't. So we talked about 5 basic biases, right, for aviation. What did we see here? Anybody venture a couple?
Confirmation bias.
Yeah, confirmation bias, absolutely. Anchoring confirmation, yep, absolutely. And confirmation, yep, absolutely. Authority, the FAA, that FedEx guy, they said clear to take off, what the hell? Right? So I exaggerate. I probably would have done the same thing. Yes?
A bit more to that. What I heard, at least from ATC, they was kind of reflecting that authority back on and says, I know what's going on.
Yes.
And what she's telling me is wrong. And I know that United is wrong because I am ATC and I am right.
And thank you for pointing that out. I did edit out about 3 minutes of stuff in this particular one. I chose this one that left out a bunch. Yes, there was even more discussion that showed even more anchoring, right, on the part of the air traffic control person. So yeah, I'd say overconfidence, anchoring authority, and optimism. Right, and I'm not sure who I'm going to attribute the optimism for. The FedEx guy, possibly, yeah, clear for takeoff, what the heck. So I'm going to point out that it only takes one of these biases to cause a disaster. They did take a lot of actions as a result of this one. There was some retraining going on. But the one thing they did, when you look at the current airport diagram, that other runway, that intersecting runway 5 left, they decided to make that into a taxiway because they thought in the analysis that some of the clearances, people were confusing 5 left with 5 right. So they do investigate near misses and incidents like that, and they do take actions. But every time I hear that guy, he's a hero. He's an absolute positive hero. All right, so I'm just going to give you one point to ponder. This is from one of my all-time favorite philosophers, who happens to also be a phenomenal magician, Penn Jillette. If there's something that you really want to believe, that's the thing that you need to question the most. Absolutely true. And there should have been a lot more questioning in there. That's it for me. We are right on time. So, Mr. Wilson, this happens.
It's amazing what Guinness does, isn't it?
It is. One of the things I love about this conference is that you guys really support local charities that are significant to you guys. Right, you guys have personal involvement with these. Thank you for the opportunity to support them. Speakers get the opportunity, I assume, to sign over whatever it was. Yeah, thank you for doing that. It's fabulous. There will be raffles with fabulous prizes on Wednesday night. Buy tickets, bring lots of folding money. Credit cards accepted for that?
Oh, credit cards and full wallets.
Credit cards and full wallets. It's going to be fun. All right, yeah, the conference charities, please, all the evaluation stuff is being done on Wahova. Please click the buttons appropriately. Hey, if you want to have fun, put in write-in comments that are completely random to entertain the people who have to read these. Thank you again for joining here, and hopefully I will suck less at risk evaluation. Thank you.
Cheers, Marty.